Soon, we will witness the story of the Titanic and the tragic moments leading to its sinking. We'll see the collision from inside the ship, examine real images of the iceberg that brought the Titanic down and the damage it caused. Then, we'll explore what those who fell into the icy waters experienced through a live experiment, all in search of the truth. The sound you just heard belonged to the distress signal sent from the Titanic. Using telegraph communication, SOS messages were transmitted to nearby ships via Morse code. The Titanic had begun to sink slowly. At the telegraph was a 25-year-old young man named Jack Phillips. He stayed at his post until the communication room was completely flooded. He acted heroically until the very end, but nothing he did could change the outcome. The Titanic was discovered for the first time 73 years after it sank, and everything began with the concealment of what was left behind. The mysterious story of the Titanic. Everything began years ago. In 1912, exactly 111 years ago. At that time, newspapers published in large headlines that the Titanic would embark on its maiden voyage, along with photos of the ship and ticket prices. In fact, the story of the Titanic was a kind of challenge. Transatlantic passenger transportation was highly profitable in those years. There was fierce competition among shipping companies for wealthy travelers and poor immigrants. In particular, two companies were in a close race, White Star Line and Cunard Line. White Star Line aimed to break a record by building two giant ships that would cross the Atlantic. While its rivals were producing ships that boasted great speed, White Star Line adopted a different strategy: luxury, comfort, and safety instead of speed. They said, maybe our ships will be slower, but who would want to cross the ocean while getting seasick? The goal was to become the most prestigious name in transatlantic travel between Europe and America within 5 years. As a result, the enormous RMS Olympic was launched, the largest ship the world had ever seen up to that time, a 45,000-ton giant. Soon after, her sister ship, the RMS Titanic, became the center of attention. Built by approximately 14,000 workers, the launching of the Titanic drew a crowd of 200,000 people. Those who witnessed her being set afloat said, it felt as if the earth itself was moving. For the people living at that time, the Titanic was a marvel beyond imagination. The Titanic was preparing to depart from Southampton on April 10, 1912, for its maiden voyage. Its destination was New York. The ship was under the command of Captain Edward Smith. Before leaving England, it would stop at the port of Cherbourg in France, and then at Queenstown, now Cobb, in Ireland. As the ship departed from the harbor, the radio operators received warnings that there might be icebergs in the North Atlantic. This was actually a routine warning. Such messages were common during the winter season. Around 9:30 p.m., another ship named Mesaba sent a new report, stating that there were large icebergs in the area. However, this message was never delivered to Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, because the radio operators were busy sending private telegrams from first-class passengers to New York. The temperature was dropping rapidly. As night fell, the sea was calm and dark. In the crow's nest, the ship's lookout post, two watchmen were on duty in shifts. One of them noticed a vague shape emerging in the darkness ahead. It was an iceberg. He immediately rang the alarm bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. There's an iceberg right ahead on the starboard side. The helmsman quickly turned the wheel, but with the ship's enormous size, it was almost impossible to change direction in time. Only 37 seconds later, at 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck the iceberg on its starboard side. The iceberg sliced through the ship's hull like a razor. The rivets in the lower section were torn apart, and 5 watertight compartments began to flood. Captain Smith called the ship's chief engineer, Thomas Andrews, to inspect the damage. Andrews soon brought the grim news: 5 compartments are flooded. The ship cannot be saved. There was now only one thing left to do: evacuate the ship. The captain ordered that women and children be loaded into the lifeboats first. However, panic was spreading rapidly throughout the ship. After the Titanic struck the iceberg, the radio operators immediately began sending distress calls. At that time, the Titanic's wireless system had a range of about 400 miles. The nearest ship was the Californian, only 32 kilometers away. However, the warning signals sent from the Titanic were not taken seriously at first. The Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, had dropped anchor in the evening because the area was surrounded by by icebergs. They decided to spend the night where they were. The Californian's radio operator, Cyril Evans, sent a message to the Titanic. "It's impossible to sail here. The whole area is full of icebergs." But Titanic's radio operator, Jack Phillips, was busy sending passenger messages to New York and replied angrily, "Shut up, I'm busy." Shortly after, Captain Smith came and ordered the operators to send urgent distress calls, first CQD, then SOS. The calls were received by several ships. Among them was the Carpathia, the closest one. The Carpathia's captain, Arthur Rostron, immediately turned his ship toward Titanic's position as soon as he received the message. But the Titanic had only about 2 hours left before it would be completely under the sea. Meanwhile, some of the Californian's crew noticed white lights being fired into the night sky, Titanic's distress flares. However, Captain Lord did not understand what they meant, and no help was sent that night. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic was completely submerged. When morning came, the Carpathia arrived at the scene. The sea was full of wreckage and a few lifeboats with survivors. The rescued people could never forget the terrifying silence of that night. When the Titanic sank, the conditions for the people who fell into the sea were deadly. The water temperature in that part of the Atlantic Ocean was around -2 degrees Celsius. According to the survivors, it became impossible to breathe just a few minutes after falling into the water. The human body quickly went into shock and the muscles froze. To study this situation, a survival expert named Dr. Mike Tipton conducted an experiment recreating the conditions of that time. In the experiment, a volunteer was immersed in water with a temperature of about 5 to 6 degrees Celsius, equivalent to the temperature of the Atlantic that night. Within a short time, the volunteer's body temperature dropped rapidly. The nervous system went into alarm, and the person began to shiver uncontrollably. This bodily reaction is an involuntary defense mechanism to produce heat. That is exactly why we shiver when we're cold. After staying in the water for 20 minutes, the volunteer lost 60% of hand strength and 40% of overall body control. According to experts, most of the Titanic passengers who fell into the sea died from hypothermia within 20 to 30 minutes. Therefore, most people did not die from the sinking itself, but from the merciless cold of the Atlantic waters. That it has long been known that the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank. But why such a large and advanced ship went down so quickly has remained a matter of debate. Some researchers claimed that the ship was built with cheap or low-quality materials. In the early 1900s, steel production was just becoming widespread. Therefore, in the Titanic's hull, especially in the front sections, old-style iron rivets were used. These rivets joined two steel plates together using heated iron. Tests later showed that this material was actually quite durable. So, the quality of the material alone cannot explain why the ship sank. The real problem was the angle of the collision with the iceberg. The Titanic didn't hit the iceberg head-on, it scraped along the side. This scraping bent the steel plates outward like a mushroom, and the rivets popped out one by one. As a result, a 90-meter-long gash opened in the hull. Ironically, if the ship had hit the iceberg head-on, it might not have sunk at all, because the damage would have been limited to just a few compartments. That night, visibility conditions were extremely poor. There was no moon, and the sea was as smooth as glass. No wind, no waves. For this reason, the lookouts could not spot the iceberg in time. Some rumors claimed that the binoculars were locked in a cabinet, and the lookouts couldn't reach them. But experts say that even if they had binoculars, it wouldn't have made a difference, because the ship was moving too fast. Visibility was short, and the iceberg could only have been seen about 1 kilometer away. That night, nature itself seemed to conspire against the Titanic. The iceberg that sank the Titanic was actually the result of a long journey. According to scientists, it had broken off from Greenland about 300 days earlier. Carried southward by North Atlantic currents, it slowly drifted toward the waters near Canada. That iceberg may have formed years earlier, from snowflakes that had fallen and, over time, compressed into solid ice, turning into a massive, silent giant weighing millions of tons. And on that dark night in 1912, it happened to be right in the Titanic's path. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. A snowflake that fell years ago eventually led to one of the greatest tragedies in human history. About 2 hours after the Titanic sank, around 5:30 a.m., dawn broke. There were still a few people alive on the surface of the sea, but most had already frozen to death. As the survivors were rescued by the Carpathia, the sea was eerily silent. Only the faint sound of waves hitting wooden debris could be heard. That night, more than 1,500 people lost their lives. Just a few hours earlier, they had been laughing, talking, putting their children to bed. And within 3 hours, they vanished into the dark waters of the Atlantic. Mothers lost their shivering children in their arms. Fathers watched helplessly as their families disappeared. Some were widowed, some lost their children, and some lost their entire families. The survivors could never forget the haunting silence of that night.
There was no impact as such. It was just like jamming your brakes on a car. And that was that. She stopped. We had a porthole open, and I looked out, and the sky was clear, the stars were shining, the sea was dead calm. And I thought, I don't know, I couldn't understand it. So I came out of my cabin, and I thought, well, I'd go forward. And I went forward to the well deck on the starboard side, and I could see ice in the well deck. There's no sign of iceberg then, because she'd passed us. And the lights were shining on the water from the portholes. There's no sign of damage above waterline. And of course, what had happened, we slipped over the iceberg. And although she was supposed to be unsinkable with a double bottom, the iceberg had cut her from forward on the starboard side to the engine room, almost amidships, right through her two bottoms. Andrews and Bruce Ismay and the captain were together discussing this, and Bruce said to Andrews, how are things down below? And Andrews said, she's going to sink, sir. Well, then things did begin to happen, because the water was kind of rushing in, and we had orders to get the lifeboats out. And of course the same old order, women and children. And we swung the lifeboats out and gradually filled them up. First boats were away on the port side. The first boats away didn't have many passengers on board. They were afraid to go down. There was a 70-foot drop to the water, and the rest were women and children. And I sat on a seat, and I sat next to Mrs. Clark, the girl I'd put into a lifeboat. And she said, the first thing she said, have you seen my husband? So I said, no, I haven't. But I expect he'll be all right. Anyway, I was in a pretty bad way then, as you can imagine, frozen solid almost. And she wrapped me round with a cloak. She had some sort of blanket or a coat on. Anyway, I think she probably saved my life, I don't know. But I saved hers. At least I think I might have done. I think I did. And she saved mine.
I believe you've even got a watch that you were wearing at the time when you went into the water.
Yes. Oh, we're going to sell me an old gunmetal watch. But I couldn't afford anything better in those early days. Here it is. This one.
What does it show us? That says 2:20. What time?
Today, the remains of the Titanic still lie. 3,800 meters beneath the Atlantic Ocean, rusted, silent, yet still a reminder that not everything that seems unsinkable truly is. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up. With love, goodbye.